When you think about Christian films, what films come to mind? I'll give you a few seconds. Let me guess. You thought of movies like God's Not Dead, God's Not Dead 2, Silly Nietzsche, God's Still Not Dead, Woodlawn, Courageous, War Room, Left Behind, or basically any other PureFlix film. And I know what you're all thinking right now. Peter, why are you making us think of these terrible movies? Isn't this the Kino Corner? You are sullying the name of your channel by the mere mention of these films. They can't even be called films, let alone Kino. Wait, hold on, stop. Put down those pitchforks and listen to me, imaginary angry villagers. Let's forget about those movies. Just forget about them. Just forget that they even exist. Take a deep breath. Okay, do you feel better? All right. You see, these are Christian films, sure, but they're not art. But what if I told you that Christianity, or more broadly religion, and art have been intertwined since before art was even a thing? Look at literally any Da Vinci painting. Listen to Handel. Art expresses ideas beyond the human reach. There's a divine nature to great works of art. So wouldn't it make sense that movies could be both Kino and religious at the same time? If you still think no, pause this video, watch Andrei Rublev and the Tree of Life. After that, you can continue watching this video. So, now is the hard part for me. Somehow, I have to convince you all that a film that features rape, murder, senseless violence, drug use, torture, Beethoven, bad driving, tights, and milk is somehow a Christian film. Adding to the difficulty is that Kubrick was an atheist. Let's look at the writer, Anthony Burgess. Who was he? He was born John Burgess Wilson on the 25th of February, 1917, to a lower middle-class family in Lancashire, England. Both his mother and his sister died the next year. He grew up with his father and stepmother, working in their shop. He took the name Anthony during his Catholic confirmation and would use that name as his pen name. He also loved music as a child, but was always told there was no money in it. His father died in 1937, and his stepmother soon followed, dying in 1940. He didn't perform too well in university, where he obtained a BA in English Language and Literature. He also didn't perform well in the military. It didn't take long for the Royal Army to transfer him from the Medical Corps to the Educational Corps. His rebellious actions that caused his transfer ranged anywhere from disrespecting authority figures to, well, desertion. Burgess married Lynn Isherwood Jones in 1942. While she was pregnant, she was raped by 4 American deserters, inducing a miscarriage of their child. No doubt this event ties directly into the rape scene in A Clockwork Orange. They remained married until her death by alcoholism-induced cirrhosis of the liver in 1968. Although to say that they were happily married is false, as he had had an affair in the 60s and had had a child with another woman who would become his second wife. Burgess went into various teaching positions after World War II. These jobs took he and his wife to Spain, Malaya, and Brunei. In Malaya, he took up writing novels as a hobby, but he became more dedicated to writing in Brunei after he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor given only 1 year to live. He wrote in hopes of securing some funds to help his wife after his death. But, unlike the rest of Burgess's life story, there is a happy ending to this one. He was discharged from Brunei and returned back home to England, where he spent time in a neurology center. They found no brain tumor, but presumed the symptoms he had were the result of alcoholism, malnutrition, and stress. He became a full-time writer upon his return home. What inspired the Nadsat language in A Clockwork Orange was a trip to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. He would publish the novel in 1962, and 10 years later the movie adaptation would be showing on screens across the world to thunderous controversy. In fact, Kubrick loved Burgess's writing so much that he commissioned him to write his Napoleon film. The film was never made, but Burgess used the material to write his novel Napoleon Symphony, a novel in 4 movements. So why am I spending so much time on Burgess? Because to understand why it's obvious that A Clockwork Orange is a Christian film, you have to understand Anthony Burgess, at least just a little bit. He was a lapsed Catholic and a monarchist who believed in a quote-unquote Catholic Jacobite imperial monarch, although he didn't think that government would come to be in his lifetime. He also wrote the novel Man of Nazareth, as well as the TV miniseries Jesus of Nazareth. Lapsed or not, there's no denying that Christianity played a major role in his life and in his work. So let's look at the film, which follows the book pretty faithfully, even if it excludes the infamous 21st chapter where Alex matures and finds redemption. Kubrick loved the book so much that he didn't want to make any major changes, unlike The Shining. Because of that, the film is still definitely Kubrick's work, but Burgess holds immense influence on the story, themes, and characters. Let's start with its structure. There are clearly distinct acts. Act 1 follows the antisocial exploits of Alex and his droogs. In Act 2, we see Alex in prison and then in aversion therapy. Act 3 sees Alex back home. Act 3 serves as the inverse to Act 1. He and his gang beat a homeless man in Act 1, just for a gang of homeless men to beat him in Act 3. What gave him pleasure then, now gives him pain. The structure suggests a sort of death and resurrection, suggesting that he is a Christ figure. But I think the correct way of thinking is that he's the inverse of a Christ figure. I mean, there's a scene in which he crucifies Jesus himself. I don't know how much clearer the imagery could be. You see, in the Bible, the Gospels portray Jesus as sinless and mostly peaceful. Only in the prophesied second coming does he come with a sword. In A Clockwork Orange, he starts off with a sword, and then after his literary death and rebirth, does he become sinless. But it's a perverted purity. He wants to sin, but it brings him great pain. I mean, he can't even defend himself against violence wrought upon him. The attacks on him aren't as great as the pain he feels fighting back. Heck, he can't even listen to a bit of the old Ludwig van. He also can't have or think about sex, but we don't want to talk about that on YouTube, do we? This raises a question about the difference between action and intent. Is a pure life truly pure if the person has sinister intentions? Does moral behavior as a result of force actually constitute as truly moral behavior? The state doesn't care as long as he no longer commits crimes. But with his violence and Beethoven listening skills gone, so is his humanity, at least outwardly. Aggression at appropriate moments, such in cases of self-defense and righteous anger, are completely natural and healthy.
You know, and you can still have righteous anger, being very strongly for something or against something beautiful.
Alex, deprived of all of this, returns home. The return home is interesting. In the time that Alex was in prison, his parents took in a tenant who now rents his room. He's a working man, a seemingly honest man, but he also resents Alex. The scene plays out like the prodigal son parable, except in the parable, the dishonored son returns home only to be embraced by his father and have his return celebrated. This angers the older son, who stayed home. In A Clockwork Orange, the parents side with the older son, and even though he's not really their older son, he is slightly older than Alex, and the dynamic is definitely that.
Well, over my dead corpse you will, because you see, they let me be more like a son to them than like a lodger.
They cast Alex back out onto the streets. So Alex is left to wander the metaphorical wilderness, where he stumbles upon his fellow droogs, now turned policemen. Upon finding out that he doesn't have a TV license, they decide to torture him. They do so by dunking his head in a trough of water. This is an obvious baptism. A baptism by violent means, yes. A baptism meant more to kill than to give him life, sure, but it's a baptism nonetheless. Now let's get to perhaps the most obvious parallel between the Bible and A Clockwork Orange: the time he spends at the writer's house. A wounded Alex collapses at the door of the writer whose wife he previously raped. Darth Vader, now his bodyguard, picks him up and brings him inside. I'm going to presume that the writer character is a self-insert of Burgess, not only because of the fact that the rape is based on the rape of his wife, but in Part 3, Burgess carries out a sort of literary revenge against the rapist, but in doing so, he casts himself as the devil. He finds out that Alex was the perpetrator when Alex casually sings Singin' in the Rain while in the bath. I want to note that Singin' in the Rain is something inherent only to the film. It's one of the main differences between the film and the book. The song triggers his PTSD and he plots revenge. What happens in the house is, I think, a parallel to the 3 temptations of Christ in the desert. Let's look at the gist of the 3 biblical temptations. 1. Turn these loaves into bread and eat. 2. Jump off from a high point. And 3. Worship me and I'll give you power. They don't play out exactly one for one, but here's what happens in the film. 1. The writer gives spaghetti and spiked wine to a very hungry Alex. Alex eats it. 2. The writer tempts Alex to jump from a high window to escape the pain of listening to Beethoven. He jumps. And 3. The writer, before the first 2 temptations, takes in Alex to use him as a tool against the government. Alex happily obliges. In fact, it's his acceptance to work with the writer that kickstarts the other 2 temptations.
That's exactly who I am and what I am, sir. A victim, sir.
And by God, you've been sent here by providence.
The major difference between Jesus and Alex in this case is that Jesus never gave in, but Alex gave in to everything. Just as their actions are reversed, so are their consequences. Jesus' resistance to temptations further purified him, solidifying his path as a savior. Alex's capitulation set him on a path of decadence. Sure, he gains his humanity back in the hospital, but the quite disturbing ending leaves us thinking that he learned nothing. He will go back to how he was in Act 1. Of course, we all know that in the book he calms down and matures in the 21st chapter, as he realizes the fault of his ways. But that chapter wasn't in American copies of the book. Even so, Kubrick didn't want to end with Alex becoming a normal member of society. He preferred the more provocative ending. I'm sure you can find more cases of religious imagery in A Clockwork Orange, like the crucified Jesuses during the Beethoven scene. But I've got to keep things as concise as possible. What A Clockwork Orange does with its Christian themes is not evangelize, but it utilizes the power of stories to penetrate deeply into the souls and minds of the viewers. Alex, as an anti-Christ figure, elevates his persona to that of a mythical being. These stories are so ingrained in our culture that one could say that they exist in our collective unconscious, if you're a fan of Young. The scenarios hit us harder, whether or not we consciously know of their biblical parallels. It's a Christian film, in the same sense that Ode to Joy is Christian. The mythology elevates it, but by no means do you have to be a Christian to appreciate its beauty. It's like an anti-New Testament, where Jesus may have showed us how to live, Alex shows us how not to live. A Clockwork Orange is the id to the New Testament's superego. It may not be obviously Christian, but it doesn't take that much digging to figure it out. So yeah, it's probably my favorite X-rated Christian film.